Well, hello and welcome to episode 5 of About Performance, the Lives of Actors. And this is Your Body Really Yours? My name is Dr. Mark Seaton and my special guest today is Roanna Mitchell, who works as a movement director and performance maker in the UK and internationally, and also as a lecturer at the University of Kent in the UK. In case you want to follow us on hashtag, it's #LivesOfActors, and you can follow me on Twitter @SenseConnection. And as with each of these episodes, you're welcome to contribute to the chat as we talk together. And if you particularly would like to ask a question, you can select on chat and select Ask a Question, and it will highlight a red label that'll make it a lot easier for us to see any questions you would like to ask of myself or Roanna. But for now, I'm going to quit our introductory screen and bring myself online. So welcome to everyone, and it's my great pleasure to also now to introduce you to Roanna. Hi. Hello. Roanna.
Hello.
Lovely to see you, and thanks for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. I thought we'll dive straight into my first question to you, because you were researching about actors and their bodies in UK drama schools. What inspired you to want to look at this area?
Well, it's been quite a long time now, actually. It started in 2009 when I was doing an MA in movement studies and working with actors and their bodies a lot. And I started to be interested there in what makes student actors not move. So I was thinking about physical inhibitions, reluctance to take space in certain ways, reluctance to really enjoy weight and space, and that kind of complicated journey of finding confidence in what one's individual body with its own idiosyncrasies and history and dreams and imagination has to offer as an actor. And I was observing lots of conversations in school corridors and in rehearsal rooms about fitness regimes and weight loss and shape, and people self-checking in mirrors and discomfort with wearing certain clothes or certain costumes. And that really got me thinking about the impact that this sort of body anxiety has on somebody who's training to be an actor, the impact that that has on them in terms of their personal well-being, but also in terms of how they're able to do their craft. And I had some informal conversations with tutors in different schools to see whether they found that this was an issue. And it turned out that a lot of tutors did consider it to be an issue, one that's really complicated for them to get a handle on, incredibly sensitive to manage. And one where the discussion about sort of guidelines or sharing of best practice really seemed to be in its initial stages at that point. So I decided to do my PhD on this and spend some more time on it, particularly thinking about the phases that tutors highlighted, which were the start of the training, which is kind of normal, I guess, people arriving in drama school and encountering their body in a really different context. But then also the end of the second year, when they know that they're looking to a third year where they may be cast to type, where they're going to have to do headshots, etc. And then the sort of third phase in the third year when it comes to showcases and preparing to be seen by agents, etc. And those are kind of the key areas that I looked at, the key areas of crisis that I discuss in the article.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yes, and I guess as you say, well, we're going to look in more depth as we continue our conversation around these notions of crisis. I guess first might be helpful for those watching this to know when you did the research. As you say, a little bit time ago, because it was your PhD, and what were the kinds of ways you approached the research question? Was it interviews? What sort of process did you do with that?
Yeah, so I did the research. I started the research, well, I guess informally in 2009, but then the main sort of proper bulk of the research case studies happened between 2010 and 2013. And I chose to focus specifically on undergraduate acting courses in the UK because that's where I'm based. And I looked at, I did case studies in 5 drama schools. And within these, my participants included 32 students in sort of between the ages of 18 and 28, and then 10 teaching staff. And then I also had a comparative set of professional actors that I interviewed to look at how the same conversations might play out with people who've gone through the training and are now already working in the industry. And I focused on those 3 sort of fulcrum points that I mentioned just now, the first, the second and the third year. And overall, the case studies involved observations and interviews and partaking in seminar discussions and also some written surveys. For the first years, I didn't do any interviews because the tutors, and I agree, I also teach in drama schools, found that the first years discovering the world and these kinds of conversations don't really seem appropriate to have with them. So with the first years, I just did observations. And then the second and third years, I had a lot of verbal contact with and discussions with. And then in-depth interviews with the tutors, as well as observing their practice. And it wasn't only lesson observations. I spent quite a bit of time in the schools, just sort of hanging out, having lunch with students to see, what kind of discussions might come up in those kind of situations, and also observing things like professional preparation sessions, headshot workshops, going to see the students at their showcases, etc.
And I gather that one of the, I don't know if it's an opening question, but one of the questions you ask these students is what they believe makes for an ideal actor. What were the kinds of things that did they perceive, and did it differ from year to year?
Yes, I mean, I was very much playing devil's advocate when I asked that question, and I did ask it specifically in terms of the body. So I asked them in terms of the body, what do you think makes an ideal actor, to see how many people would talk about appearance, and I think there was a difference from year to year, although I didn't interview the first years, so I think the responses again would have been different for them. The responses were really mixed. So we had a big set of responses that were about flexibility, responsiveness, the ability to physically transform, being fit and having stamina and being healthy. But then there were also those students who said, you need to have a sellable appearance. And some students said, sellable appearance should not be at the top of the list of determining what an ideal actor is. And then other students actually got quite irate and said, we've gone through all of this, and at the end, actually, really, they could have told us that this is all that matters. Looking right for the part is all that matters. And obviously, each of those students will have had their individual journey and will have their particular reasons for why they say that. It differs from school to school, and actually also over time I think it changes. There have been phases where actually the anxiety is bigger at the end of the second year because they're imagining everything. They don't actually know yet what's going to happen. So in one school, for example, the students get sent away at the end of the second year, and over the summer they're asked to get their headshots done, and they know that when they come back they will start to be cast to type. And so that summer then presents this sort of big terror regime for them, where they have to go away and sort of get the perfect headshot that captures their essence in some magical way. And for some I think that's actually more difficult than the third year, when they're going to be seen by the agents. So there was quite a big range in terms of the ideal actor when the question is asked that openly. But when I asked this question more specifically in one of the surveys, or when students were asked whether they thought that the industry, whether they felt a pressure from the industry to have a particular body, 92% said they did. And then when they were asked to list how that body would be described, the most common descriptors that they used were slim, sexy, toned, and characterful and individual. So there's kind of a paradox there, which I think the students are very much aware of, where they know that they have to distinguish themselves from other actors in order to be able to get work, but they also know that the industry is going to favour those who are slim and sexy and toned. And then they have to navigate what that means.
That must be, I can only imagine that must be quite confronting, self-confronting, and desiring at the same time. Like, you know, it's socially very attractive, so one understands it. So it is that paradox or dichotomy, or a tension that can be both excitingly creative tension or really traumatic if you feel you're not going to meet those requirements, or if you already see there's some impediment on you visually or something. Yeah. So yeah, this is I guess brings me to my next question. As I read through your article, that these human beings, these young human beings who invest themselves as actors, they're investing themselves in a profession, and you talk about the idea of an actor having physical capital, like a bank account of physical attributes or qualities, and you also distinguish between their capital and their work, their labour. Perhaps you might like to say a bit about where you derive this idea of physical capital from, and then we might talk about the difference between capital and labour, or however you want to tackle it.
Yeah. So when I'm talking about physical capital, I'm drawing on Bourdieu, who suggests that embodiment is a part of social exchange, and that the body is commodified through and for social and professional forms of exchange. So he suggests that the body becomes a form of capital because what does he say? It's read as a possessor of status and power, and that's integral to the accumulation of other resources. And I was drawn to use this kind of language because I found that the actors themselves were using this kind of language a lot. So they were talking about how they were investing in their body and what kind of traits were seen as valuable, and talking about sellable appearance. So I thought, okay, if they're all using this language, then I'm going to run with it and see what I find out in the process. And I think, I mean, the actor has physical capital because everything that they do by virtue of their body, and the way in which they use their body and the way in which their body appears while it's being used are all crucial aspects as to how successful they're deemed to be in their professions, how they're valued, how they're employed. Within that, I make the distinction between active physical capital and aesthetic physical capital. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I think that the actor's physical capital is mainly valued based on two big things, which is their capacity for transformation and their capacity for representation. And that is always measured, obviously, in relation to the field in which they're working. So different performance contexts and styles require different types and degrees of transformation and different symbolic or realistic representations. So depending on the kind of physical capital that an actor has or develops, they might find it easier to be employed in certain fields and harder to be employed in other fields.
just to capture that a little more, flesh it out in terms of, say, like some actors would be what we call character actors. They can transform their body and they almost become unrecognizable, whereas others, it's actually about being recognized and having an attractiveness. That's the kind of distinction you're making there.
Yes, indeed. And also because so much of, I should also say that this research was focused particularly on the commercial performance industry, rather than sort of the fringe sector. And within that, typecasting is still kind of the way often that the actors are employed. And that is very much attached to the way that culturally we read bodies. And I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but the whole sort of, you have to be funny if you're fat, and you have to, certain stereotypes attached to certain ethnicities, etc. And that obviously all feeds into how you're read to have capital, depending on what kind of job you're going for. Yeah.
So what about difference between, or distinction between capital and labor? Is labor to do with what the body actually does? Is that what you mean, the transform?
Yes, I think in a sense, labor is what you do and capital is what you have. Right. But I don't actually think that I'm separating labor from capital. Actually, on the contrary, I'm probably suggesting that the doing aspect, the labor, is actually an inherent part of the actor's physical capital. Right. Again, I'll talk about that more in a moment. But I think what you're referring to is my reluctance to stick with the kind of existing discourse on aesthetic labour. So there's quite a lot of work being done on aesthetic labour, particularly in relation to the service industry, is looking at what kind of appearance management is required by, for example, air stewardesses, etc. And that is valuable and really relevant to actors as well as it also would be for models, for example, and it offers some interesting perspectives. But there are also problems with that because it again focuses on appearance, but then other people have suggested that there's also emotional labour that is invested in order to make the aesthetic labour happen. And so actually by itself, it doesn't really function so well as a tool. And also I was really keen to find a way of looking at the actor's physical capital that takes account of artistic principles and artistic values, the way that the body is valued for what it can do as well as how it appears, and the fact that those two things are really tied together. And I mean, the reason why I was looking at all of that in the first place is because I think that the way that in which the actor thinks that their body is valued by those who will potentially employ them has a really profound impact on how they live, how they manage their body, what they choose to do, what they say yes to, what they say no to, and how they feel about those things.
Do you find that over the years that you look at them, that it shifts from feeling there's more weight or importance about what my body can actually do to how my body appears as it's doing, or is this an ongoing tension between the two? I mean, both, as you say, are intricately woven together.
Yeah.
How does it work out in the courses of training?
I think there is a change, and I think that's kind of inevitable because the training in most institutions starts with an exploration of what the body can do, and the evaluation is always based on what we saw you doing, not what we saw you look like while you were doing. And there aren't any mirrors, and everybody wears the same clothes. Most schools, the students are wearing blacks, etc. But then inevitably, when they start thinking about things like their headshots and what are the agents going to see, etc., then that does start to get difficult. And if you're made to look ugly in your showcase because that's what that part requires, then will that stop you from getting agents? Can your headshot compensate for that, etc.? Those are the kind of questions that they're asking then when it gets closer to graduating. That's, I mean, when I say those are the tendencies. I can't generalize and speak obviously for every single student, because some students never encounter that as a problem at all.
And is there any significant difference between attitudes and expectations of males and females about their aesthetic capital, or how they look and sound and present themselves? Are there some gender specific issues or themes?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? But I didn't really find that was the case so much. I think what they definitely have in common is this thing about youth. When they come off the undergraduate courses, and they're very aware of the fashions of the body. Actually, sometimes I wonder whether the male students are even more aware, or actually maybe it's just that they're more vocal about it. I found that in discussions, the male students were incredibly articulate and really happy to talk about how they experienced all of this and what their thoughts were about that and what pressures they did feel and what choices they were thinking about making, etc. I thought that it would be much more of a thing for the female students, but actually I didn't find that was the case, interestingly.
Which is really great to discover sorts of things in research. This is why research such as yours is so valuable, because it goes against what we might think or even hear anecdotally, but when you actually explore it without placing a judgment on it, that's what comes to the surface, which is really very helpful.
Indeed,
so I guess if I might now look to the actual term, the use of the word crisis to describe the student's actor's relationship to his or her body. Would you like to say why you chose that word and what things you're hoping to bring out in your research through the use of that word?
Yeah, well, I would use the word crisis to describe certain instances of the student's relationship with their body in training. So I'm not suggesting that student actors are in a sort of constant state of crisis in relationship to their body. But I am drawing on Chris Schilling, who offers a kind of this sort of framework to account for the individual kind of mediation of experience when it comes to physical capital, rather than just saying all the things we do are determined by the dynamics of exchange, because obviously there's also the individual input and agency within that to an extent, some people might argue. So Schilling says that a crisis happens when our habitual actions are disrupted. So when, in a way, that an individual's accustomed way of being in the world doesn't work anymore, doesn't quite fit anymore, or isn't sufficient anymore for what the situation is asking for. And Schilling then suggests that when that happens, when that crisis happens, then the individual will seek creative ways to readjust and renegotiate their embodied relationship with the world. And I think for looking at actor training, that's a really useful way of looking at students' relationship with their body, because I think that actor training is really built on moments of crisis in a really productive way. Most students start their training, as we talked about before, start their training by being made aware of their habits. So that's kind of the first moment of crisis where they go, okay, this is what I always did, but what else could I do? And then suddenly it's a free-for-all, and they go, oh, okay, what else could I do? And that's quite scary. And obviously, if you question your habits, then you're kind of questioning who you are in the world. And that's kind of that first moment. And then throughout the training, that is the sort of constant thing of how that's the thing that enables creative physical expressivity, that constant questioning and not getting stuck in habits. And in a way, that's always part of learning something new, but in actor training, that's kind of particularly used as a galvanizing force, that kind of encouraging people to always be in the moment and always question again. But I think the thing is that in the moment of crisis, everything is thrown up in the air. It's a free-for-all. And that means that there's a risk, potentially, that the creative revelation that the students make use of in order to resolve their crisis can be co-opted by whatever the students think will make them most valuable by the end.
Right.
So it's like,
Most
how do I resolve
acceptable.
that crisis with the most positive, productive, valuable outcome? And also with an outcome that will make me feel safe again. So, for example, many tutors express concern about phases when some students begin to go on strict diets or exercise regimes, and they quite often notably transform their body in that process. And those kind of regimes are associated by psychologists with feelings of safety and agency and control. So it might be that students are resorting to those kind of regimes as a way to regain control over their identity, but they're not using the tools from the actor training in that moment. They've gone somewhere else and used these other tools of self-improvement that we culturally are marketed all the time as tools for self-improvement. And so, yeah, that for me, that the moment of crisis is a key thing of actor training that I think has to be there. I think it's crucial, but I also think that it's kind of the weak point, the space where other discourses on the body can come in, can be brought in by the students in those moments.
That's great. It's such a rich area to discuss, and I really appreciate the emphasis you're making that crisis is not a bad thing. Crisis is, in a sense, an inevitable thing when you are transforming your sense of self and identity and gaining new skills and new ways of being in the world as a professional and then as a character. Like there's several layers. It's quite multiple. The crises one goes through, I would imagine.
Yes, and I mean, one of the things I'm talking about is when does the balance between active and physical capital become destabilized, and when are students tempted to focus more on the aesthetic, and they know, of course, that there are certain parts of their job where that's always going to be the case. If they go up for an audition for an advert, for example, chances are, first of all, they'll be picked for their look. Yep. But I think that it's in the moment in terms of how they negotiate maintaining a balance between the active and the aesthetic, understanding that I should rewind for a moment. So in performance, I think the active and the aesthetic are always read in relation to one another, right, to a great extent. So so the actor does, and while they're doing, we see them. So the quality with which they do something impacts the way that we see them aesthetically. So they're doing, and their aesthetics are tied together, but also the aesthetics with which they walk on stage before they've even done anything. So what they look like as they walk on already color the way that we then read what they're going to do. And so those things are always intertwined, and in an ideal world, they would be inseparable. But I am distinguishing between the two because I think that sometimes they are separated. And I think that in moments, there are it's the moments of crisis are the moments where it might be that they look towards the aesthetic because it's a more concretely manageable thing, maybe. Something where we're given some tools to do, and I know that in some schools, because everything for the actor is so up in the air and intangible, because especially at the beginning of the training, it's like, okay, so by Christmas you would be able to do one press up with your nose touching the ground, just so that you've got one achievable thing where you can see that you've done it, when all of the other things are so sort of movable. Yes, so I've lost my thread. Where am I coming back?
I just like that dynamic you described there. That you do go searching for something solid and concrete in those moments when everything else seems to be very uncertain, constantly changing, and you are being taught appropriately, always room for improvement. It's not like you ever get there and you go, right, well, that box is ticked, I now know how to do know how to memorize dialogue, or even simple things like, which aren't that simple, but it's something, it's a craft, and it's not like a to-do list that you just tick off things that you do, as much as the curriculum might give the illusion maybe that you are ticking off a list of things. So I think that's really important. And I also appreciate your distinction between the active, the way in which it's a craft, but also the aesthetic, the way in which that craft is experienced socially and culturally, and certain value judgments are placed on by your peers, by the teachers, by visiting directors who come and direct shows that you're gaining your skills in. Then your family and your friends are no doubt making their judgments as they see you and your mates go through the performance process. And then you've got your antenna up to look for what does the industry think is hot now, and what's marketable and saleable. Because at the end of the day, as much as we know that people who engage in acting are wanting to be creative and express themselves and express the things that they think are important about life, and they have to eat, so they know that that's the game that they've invested in and will need to invest their lives in, and they hope in a very productive, successful way. So there's nothing wrong with that that agenda, I guess.
No.
Ryan, sorry, you'd like to say something about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just thinking about the way in which that is so concrete, you know, actors talking to me and saying, oh, I'm just saving up to get my teeth done because I want to work in America, and you have to have your teeth done before you do that, you know. And those are our realities. And a really interesting story where one actor was saying that after he'd graduated, he'd just chosen to bulk up, you know, assuming that this would be good for him to get work, and then realized that his face, though, is very young, so his headshot was getting him called in for jobs where actually then his body didn't fit the job anymore. Wow. So he was talking about possibly having made the wrong choice in the way that he'd invested in his body.
Yes.
Oh,
yeah. Well, that's interesting because one of the aspects of our survey of actors' health and wellbeing here in Australia is we did ask a question, but we hadn't actually yet done the analysis yet to report on. But we asked of the 800 actors, have you ever needed to do any body modification work? And we know that many said yes, and they told us what those things were. I don't have the statistics for it, but we knew it was a question we needed to ask because it comes with the territory. These may not be permanent body modifications. They may be temporary ones, but we wanted to even track those things like weight loss, weight gain, bulking up, thinning down for different roles and characters. And of course, the demands are different from a stage scenario where something of what you change may not even be viewable beyond row 20 versus film where you are forever in close-up and far more exposed.
Yeah. Well, I'll be really interested to see the results of that.
Yes.
Yeah, I have had interesting conversations, and we've done some interesting workshops with the students where we've asked them, how far would you go for your dream job, and then, you know, listed all of the possible modifications, and had the actors take a step forward for everything that they said that they would do, see what would happen. And the sort of weight loss, weight gain were the things that were that most people said that they would do, which I think there's a lot more education needed about the impact long term that has on the body, on the person, because it's actually really, really bad for you, and it's not temporary because the effects of it will last forever. And you know, you mentioned earlier that you'd read that Tom Hanks, you know, was now quite ill, and that his doctors were attributing that to his extreme weight fluctuations. I hope the students read it.
Yes. Well, it's actually one of the resources I'm intending to make available on my website as part of the service to actors' health and wellbeing, is because a lot of these reports, only certain parts of the media pick them up, and only if you go looking for articles on actors' health and wellbeing will you find them, which many actors won't necessarily go and certainly student actors in the prime of their youth are feeling that they're in control of life and it's all good, which is which is a nice way to be. But yes, and just before we went on air today, for those of you watching, I was sharing with Roanna that here in Australia, an article reporting on Jake Gyllenhaal in his upcoming film role of Southpaw, where he's playing the role of a boxer. The media report takes, I think, the usual enthusiasm that they do with observing how actors seem to do the impossible, the extraordinary, by bulking up and putting on, I think, 7 kilograms of weight. And this is after he'd lost many kilograms of weight for another film which required him to be very thin, a film called Nightcrawler. And these are the things that, unless you've got a person who is a professional doctor who is good at their job at monitoring your diet and your overall health and well-being, that you are in really risky, dangerous territory, as you just said, Roanna. So yeah, it's something that needs more education from student days onward.
Yes, indeed.
So I think this might be a pertinent time to start to raise, is there, in this context of crises and making these kind of choices, what role do you think teachers already do have in terms of duty of care to their students? Or are there things that you feel could be done better, that teachers should be practicing an ethical duty of care in helping students with their habitual actions and creative revelations as they go this journey?
I do think there's a duty of care. I think that tutors need to be aware of the possible tools that students may draw on other than what they offer them, and the reasons why they may draw on those tools, because it's not enough to just say, don't do that, because if everybody else is doing that and they see people who are being employed doing that and those people are very successful in their film roles, then why should they not do that? So I think it's really important that within the curriculum, this is a legitimate topic of conversation, and a critical one, and one where the politics of all of this are brought in, and the morals and the health discourse that goes with it, and the things like the sort of vilification of fat and the kind of scaremongering to do with the obesity epidemic, and all of those things are kind of considered. And I think sometimes there's a reluctance to do that. There's a reluctance to talk too much in some institutions. Yes. But I think it's really important. I think it's an integral part of what the actor needs to do. They need to know what choices they're making. They need to know when they say yes, what they're saying yes to. If they agree to something that actually goes against their principles because they need to pay the rent this month, then it's good, though, that at least they know that they've gone through that thought process, and they know what they've chosen and why they've chosen it, and they know that they have a choice. And maybe next time they don't need to pay the rent, and they might go, actually, you know what, I'm not doing that, because that's the only way that anything's going to change, I think. I don't think the solution is to put more counselling in place or more pastoral care and sort of individual student things. Obviously, those things are all incredibly important, and that's a different set of issues, that there's not enough resources to deal with all of the stuff that's coming from the students at the moment in the UK and universities in general. That's a big issue. But I actually think that this is more about the overall structure of the curriculum.
I really appreciate that boldness in that, because I think that's often where it gets sidelined. Or if it's a health issue or something, we'll make it an individual concern, which actually can subtly and I think problematically make it as though the problem is with the student rather than with the system.
That's exactly what.
Or with the industry, and not necessarily a problem, but a challenging ethical political, social reality that you've got to grapple with and think through and maintain, what, you and I, when we're academics, we talk about agency, but it's that, for those who are watching the show who are not academics, we would also say it's about the ability to make a choice and to make choices so that you can act on those choices and have a sustainable practice, working practice.
Yes.
So I think that's it's a really helpful thing, Roanna, for us to be communicating through these webinars, as you've done your research and others have contributed, that there's so much that could be considered more carefully within the curriculum rather than just put to one side as a pastoral care issue or a counselling issue for individuals. That needs to be part of the training program. Could I also pick up on, I noticed you said that you said there's often a reluctance to talk a lot in the classroom, in the acting classroom, and I wondered if you were referring to that sense where there's a concern sometimes that actors think too much, talk too much rather than doing, that somehow that takes away from their ability to be spontaneous and in the moment. Is that the kind of trip that we sometimes err on the side of not having enough intelligent conversation between actors?
I think so, yes. I mean, I think there's definitely a place for not talking, and I completely see where that is coming from, because many times if I come into rehearsal rooms and made the actors get up because they were just sitting and talking rather than getting on their feet and trying to make the work happen. But I think there has to be place for those discussions, because students are, and I mean, in some cases it does, but it depends. It's I mean, this is why this is so difficult, because it's so tricky to find out where to place those conversations, how to place them in relation to practice, not to put them in the wrong place in the curriculum so that students don't start critiquing something before they've even had a chance to explore it.
Yes.
And that's quite a difficult balance to strike, which is why there isn't a sort of catch-all answer to, this is the best practice, this is what we're going to do. It's really important that each institution and all of the teachers figure out what works specific to them and their curriculum, I think. But I mean, actors are such intelligent human beings, trained, so sensitive in the way that they perceive the world, and so and they love to examine that and exchange about that, and I think it's great to harness that within the curriculum.
Yeah, I think that's really a proactive way of dealing with this. As you say, it's going to be on a school by school basis, but just honouring, as you say, that actors, that those who are drawn into acting are very often very intelligent, very inquisitive and sensitive individuals, and that's why we love what they do. This came out actually last week when I had Ross Pryor from University of Northampton, and a colleague of Chris Hay, who is a lecturer at the National Institute of Dramatic Arts here in Sydney, both very much affirming that sometimes the public stereotype of the student actor who just wants to muck around and play is far removed from, in fact, the very intelligent, thoughtful young actor who has some real things to engage with in the ideas of plays and screenplays and social values and so on that they want to contribute to that discussion. So I think that's really important that we affirm that. Yeah. Could I take you now to another part of the discussion in your paper, where you talk about some metaphors that are often used in the classroom, the metaphor of the body as instrument and the metaphor of the body as container. Could you perhaps say a bit, so for those people who may not have thought of this, that these are metaphors and not necessarily reality, and why you think those are important metaphors to be understood and managed?
Well, in my overall thesis, I look a lot at metaphors, because I find that they emerge in the language and the way that people talk about their bodies, but they say something about the way that we experience and treat and assess and value bodies. And I do think that they're never just metaphors. I think that they are more than metaphors. I think, I mean, Lakoff and Johnson say that all metaphors are embodied. I really profoundly believe that the more that we talk about the body in a certain way, the more that way of thinking about the body becomes part of the way that we interact with the world. So lots of so there are sort of some key ones that I go through, and in this article I'm talking about the body as instrument and the body as container, and in another article I talk about another really important one, which is the body as servant, and the way that they sort of exist within the training. And the body as instrument is used a lot. The body is your instrument. The students will say our body is our instrument, and they're quite often echoing teachers who've said, your body is your instrument, that's what you do. And they're sometimes talking about a musical instrument, but more often than not, they're talking about the instrument in the sense of a tool. And that metaphor automatically separates you from your body. There's you somewhere in there, and then there's your instrument, which you can manipulate and shape and use in a certain way. In the article I specifically talk about an instrument that is fit for purpose, and how do you make your instrument fit for purpose. And that doesn't really bring to the fore sort of sense of self-care or listening to what your body needs or what your body is doing in that moment. It's more a sense of, how can I get this thing into shape? And again, I'm sort of deliberately exaggerating, but there are those sort of different interpretations of what that thing then means. And the same with the body as container. I mean, that is a general metaphor that we all have. We feel like, oh, I'm a bit out of it today. I'm a bit out of myself today, or I feel really in my body today. And but when we feel it bugs us if we feel like people don't really understand us. They see us differently from the outside than we feel that we are from the inside. And for the actors, that's a real problem, because if the audience sees them differently from the outside to what they thought they were doing, then that's not great for their job.
And confusing as well for them.
Yes.
I suspect. Yeah.
Really confusing. And I mean, the metaphors are quite often used as educational tools, but I think there needs to be more awareness of what they do, because they conjure up certain images in the student's head and they make them think about their body in certain ways. I think the body as servant is a really really difficult and dangerous one, because it's so kind of no pain, no gain. You make your body do the show must go on. You work through the pain. All of those things the body serves, and that is all about rigorous discipline and strict control and all of that. And how can you explore and be creative and allow yourself to take yourself by surprise and all of those things if you're in that sort of doing mode?
Yes, and it seems to me actually when seems you've chosen potentially more neutral term in the word servant than if you'd chosen the word slave. Did you contemplate using slave, or did you decide that servant allowed you a bit more flexibility? I
think I use servant because it has a sort of a noble quality about it, and I think that there is something, I know you've written about this as well, there's something about this kind of the joy of the self-sacrifice, and that being a valuable thing. You sacrifice yourself for your art, you're serving your art, or you're serving the business, or possibly you're serving yourself, depending where you lay the weight. And so that makes that term, I feel, more appropriate. And it is also the word that's used that sort of crops up in the language that people use.
Yes, being the servant of the text, I'm thinking another place in which is often used. So we all serve the text, and as you know, that's a place of responsibility and respect. So it does carry that, and you're right. I guess it would also tap into that willing vulnerability that I write about in my work around the vulnerability of the actor, but they're willingly vulnerable. They're willing to give and expose and be courageous and take risks. So we wouldn't. A slave has no choice. A servant chooses to serve, and I think that makes for a very sensible distinction between that. And it's good to explore that just as a. In fact, while I think about it, so we don't miss the question in my head later on, is or more comments is if you're happy. I'd be very happy to help people find a link to your fuller PhD on this area in case they would like to look at it in greater depth than what you cover in the article in our chapter in our publication. So I just mentioned that, and we can explore that possibility.
Yes.
So I've got another question that you make a distinction between students being healthy and looking healthy, and I think you saw this as a challenge for both students and staff in drama schools, this perception between actually being healthy or were they just looking healthy?
Yes, I mean, that's a massive challenge in the schools, and more generally, actually, culturally, that's a massive challenge as well. So we obviously have the cultural context that a certain body type is deemed to be healthy. But BMI is used as a measure for that, which isn't an accurate measure of anything really. It's just your weight times your height. Doesn't tell us it's a number, but it is used to categorize people and make judgments about how healthy they are. So for students, this is stressful because they might find that they're very active, they're feeding themselves well, they've got a balanced diet, they're quite happy, but they're not thin. And so there's not actually anything wrong with them, but they're not seen as being healthy. So for them, that then causes a problem, and they may start to diet, which actually will make them more unhealthy than they were before because diets don't work, so their weight will fluctuate, etc. So that's one problem. And then there's obviously the problem of teachers' prejudices as well, teachers' assumptions that certain bodies are healthy and certain bodies are not healthy. And again, that's all a really tricky area that I still struggle to see how that is resolved without sort of getting really up in students' business, because some students might just be really skinny and have nothing wrong with them and might have people coming up to them all of the time saying, have you eaten yet? Whereas other students might be really healthy but be fat and be told to lose weight all the time. And it's just really, it's a minefield, that one. It really is.
But surely
again,
sorry, go on.
what the actors can do. I was saying this, I think again the solution is to look at what the actors can do, because that says more about their state of well-being and their health than their appearance. So that's really a re-education, not only of the students, but actually of the staff generally. Massively, yes. Yes. In a statement, yes. Yes. I mean, it's not just in drama schools, though. These conversations are obviously happening everywhere, because right now the solution for everyone is lose weight and everything will be fine, which is a load of rubbish.
Yeah, good. And towards the end, I'd like to come back to that particular passion of yours, because I know that informs a lot of your other projects. So we might come back to that and your TED talk and things like that. So we'll come back to that. But if I might go to just a few more questions, and we'll see if there are any questions from any others. But I wanted to ask, you've already discussed about the importance of metaphors and the language around metaphors and how that actively does shape the way we experience our bodies and so on. Is there any other language you think that teachers are using in acting schools that perhaps they need to be more conscious of as its impact on students? Is there any other particular styles of language and communication that you see habitually being used by teachers that you wonder how the student is making sense of that?
Yeah, I'd love to do a proper massive study to look at that in more detail. I definitely think yes, but I don't have a sort of list of the words. There's a nice example from Vanessa and Debbie at Central that run the Actors' Body Identity and Image Research Group there, who years ago sort of went, oh my goodness, for years that we've been saying to the actor, trust, trust, but really we should have said risk. And that's a really different engagement with the thing, and a really different power relationship with the teachers, etc. So it really changes things a lot. So there are those kinds of things, and then there are also I know from speaking to people in wardrobe departments in schools that there are still that students are still being told to lose weight or appearance is commented on in certain ways that isn't appropriate or helpful in any way. And I think that all needs to be evaluated and really looked at. And that's something where really best practice guides can be drawn up by institutions, and the staff can be trained. And, it's like, if you make this comment or if you applaud this actor for this specific thing, what are the things there really what about your own prejudices and your own aesthetic preferences is being made really obvious to the students there. And I think that is the thing that needs to constantly be re-examined, I think.
Which is actually engaging with both, not only, as you say, verbal affirmations or criticisms, but actually also just practices of affirmation and criticism that may at times be even unspoken. So there is actually, it's really inviting the teaching staff to become a little more reflective about their practice and its impact on not only the individual student, but the student body, because that's what gets reinforced between students and can lead, I imagine, to scenarios of bullying and or harassment of students by students, if not teachers of students harassing or bullying practices there, which, as you say, can have a better or best practice guideline, which is often not really talked about in such institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't encounter any stories about bullying, but that wasn't the specific thing, I guess, that I was asking about when I was talking to students and teachers. But definitely, there's lots of sort of, what's called the hidden curriculum that's sneaking around that people need to be aware of. I know that in one institution's students who I interviewed previously on this issue came up to me at the end of the year and said, have you seen who they've chosen to put on all 3 of the posters on the front of the school? And I was really pleased that they were being critical about it and sort of noting it and being, this is what's going on. But at the same time, it's like, well, the teachers need to think about how they make those choices, and not just the teachers, but also the admin staff. What are they reflecting? Who are they reflecting? What kind of landscape are they creating in terms of visuals as well?
Indeed, yes. So if we then look at what happens between, well, actually this might lead to what happens between the students themselves, the kind of conversations they have with their peers, with their families about appearance. Is that something that can be shifted as well, or does that come back to the curriculum and to the teaching staff as the first point of shifting criticism among peers or family and peers? Any thoughts on that?
I think there are lots of things that schools can do. I think there are also lots of things that schools can't do, but I think there are lots of things people can do. So I know that there are teachers who say, if they will interrupt conversations about makeup and hairstyles and shoes and whatever, and say, that's not what we're here for right now. This is not productive. but there are also things like Fat Talk Free Week that we have in the, I don't know whether it's global actually.
No, you might like to say something about that, because I'm not familiar with it in this country.
Yeah, embarrassingly right now I can't remember when it is either, but it's basically celebrating the idea that conversations about what's wrong with your body aren't actually a particularly positive thing, and you don't get anything from them. So many, I think particularly women, I don't know though, because I'm not a man, so I don't know. But women bond over those kinds of conversations. And so often you'll see two friends meet and the first thing they do is have you look so great. Oh yeah, well, I haven't been eating sugar for 3 weeks. And so, oh really, how's that going for? And then, you have this whole, yeah, but my thighs are still so fat. And it comes out of an anxiety that needs to be articulated, and I understand that, but it doesn't, it just reinforces the same thing. And I think it's that is just as relevant for actors as it is for everybody else. It's good for them to be aware that actually those conversations have a really real negative impact, and it's really empowering to go, actually, I'm not going to have that conversation now. Let's talk about this book I'm reading instead.
Yeah, so that's really shifting a cultural practice and shifting a default habit, which in itself is another nice crisis moment of repositioning identity in a new way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's interesting. So how integral do you think is it that the broader entertainment industry and institutions like Drama UK and Equity are part of these conversations, these educational conversations? I mean, where is there a place where you think that they could or maybe already do have a conversation with individual drama schools like Drama UK, or alternatively Equity, or casting agents? I don't know. These are some of the possible stakeholders.
Well, I mean, there are professionals obviously who who are part of these conversations because they come in and run workshops with the students towards the end of the third year. And I think it would be really useful. Well, I don't know actually, because the thing is that their perspective on this is very different. And I'm not always sure that all of them bring in things that are useful for the actors. Sometimes it just terrifies them.
Could you say a little more about what are the things that might terrify them? Or,
well, just in terms of the expectations that they may have, or the realities of,
right,
this will get you work and this won't get you work, and those kinds of things. Yeah, I'm not so sure really, because my experience so far has been one of people. I think I see more hope for things happening from the ground upwards, coming out of education, rather than people who've already been working for a long time changing things that they've been doing that way for a long time. But maybe it's a bit of both. And obviously there are also people who've been working for a long time who do brilliant work and are very open-minded in their casting practices, etc. So it'd be good to take the lead from them. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to see how to bring them into the educational conversation, and attempts have been made, and so far they've not been that successful. I think. I mean, Jeff Coleman talks really interestingly at Central about inviting in a load of agents so that they could tell Central what it is that they want from actors. And they ended up apparently having a massive heated argument because they really weren't quite sure what they wanted.
Right.
And so Jeff Coleman's, he's the head of acting at Central. He was saying, the industry knows what it wants when it sees it.
Yes.
And so actually the schools are in a position of power in a sense, because they are providing the actors, and then the industry goes, oh yeah, I'll have that, please. Yes, but everyone's quite good at passing the buck on to the next person and going, their responsibility to change. Yeah.
Yeah. That's all right, Roanna. I think you've described very adequately the very complex interplay between the different stakeholders. And I think that this happens in Australia as well. In fact, in Australia, we have the challenge of not having, well, I think it's maybe a challenge. We don't have a body like Drama UK, partly because we don't have the number of conservatoire or similar vocational training institutions in our country so it's you could count them on one hand, the number of at least government accredited institutions, maybe two hands. So I shouldn't discount those private institutions in this country that have government recognized degrees, but nonetheless you've got a much larger population in the UK, and so an organisation like Drama UK that vets all the programs is something that we don't have in Australia. So we do have with Actors Equity, they will provide visits to the various schools in their final year, like the third year students, and will bring about some of that educational or potentially educational resourcing about what agents are thinking, looking for, how they work, how they function, how do you fit in the industry? So we have those kind of exchange programs as well. But when it comes to actually curriculum design, I'm certainly conscious, as having been a Dean of Education of an arts institution in this country, that the opportunity theoretically is there for industry to inform educational institutions on how do we make this work for everybody so that everybody wins, so that the students win, they get employment, the industry wins because it gets good people who are crafted people as well as looking good and being competent in their profession. And yet, as you say, it seems much more fraught when you actually try and bring real individuals together into particular contexts, and that might be why it's not. I think I might refer to Pierre Bourdieu, that sociologist who very helpfully argues that the field is not as neat and tidy as it looks, and there may not be one industry. In fact, there are multiple industry players who all have different agendas and different investments in capital. Yes. As well. So I think it's great to have people like you and myself and others who are moving between these fields, who are asking these questions and inviting students to think critically, and as you say, and actors who maybe are just out, who are still able to think critically about how they fit into the profession. So yeah, it's all good stuff. So I guess finally, I'd like to look at the way in which you conclude your chapter, and I'll just refer to my notes here, that you note that there is and I think we've already touched on this a bit, you said it's an area for further engagement where students will make sure that they find some place of safety when they're told to, when they're encouraged to abandon their former place of being one kind of person before they become actor, that they'll tend to go for things that may not be part of the curriculum, but give them a sense of safety and control, such as dieting or bodybuilding or physical manipulation or whatever. Are there any people you'd like to have a part of that conversation? Let's look at that one first, about the, I guess maybe it's the teachers need to be aware that this is one of the we'll use, and maybe they're not aware of that as a strategy?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yes. Okay.
I think that and the next, actually, I would like to take them together.
Okay.
If that's okay. The next point that you're about to raise, which is about, when students are tempted, well, they are kind of the same point, but where they're being tempted to lay more weight on the aesthetics in their job.
How they're seen rather than how they perform. Yeah.
Yes. And I think, again, what I would love to see aside from the things that we've already talked about, which is teachers questioning their own aesthetics and their language, and for more opportunity for students to critically discuss what their body means and what it means to sell your body as an actor, etc., and what choices that involves, etc., and how, to what degree that can be empowering. So all of those conversations, I think, need to happen. What would be great is if the people who are being trained to be all of the other people in the industry could learn to understand the actor's language. So acting teachers, directors, producers, even people like lighting designers potentially, all of these people, if they could understand the language of qualities. So it's interesting, I did a workshop at the Young Vic with the Young Vic is a theatre in London that has an emerging directors programme that some wonderful people have come out of, and I ran a workshop with them as part of my research that was all about the body politics of working with actors. And sorry, and lost my train of thought.
Body politics of working with actors.
Oh yes, one of the things that one of the tasks that I gave them to do within that was that I asked them to write a casting breakdown without describing the actor's appearance. So I was challenging the directors to describe what qualities they were looking for. Something where using metaphors is great. Actors understand those really well. You know, if you say we're looking for somebody with a moth-like quality, then the actor can start to think about, you know, am I good at that particular way of using weight and space, and do I know that I can produce this quality, rather than going, do I look right for this thing, and how can I make myself look like that? Because that's the language that the actors know really well, and if the people who are employing them knew that language better, knew how to articulate it better and to recognize it, we could have such an amazingly more various landscape of performers out there. Because if you get really good at writing those casting briefs and the actors get really good at recognizing what they're good at and they show up for those, then you end up picking and casting people that you never in your head beforehand had imagined would be that role, but then they walk in and do it perfectly. That's sort of my utopian kind of, if we could get people to become more eloquent and knowledgeable about that way of looking at the acting craft, rather than so carried away with the kind of two-dimensional image.
Yeah, I think, Roanna, that is a very commendable and potentially I think also doable thing too. Just my observation as you describe that is, I think actually it actually does play out in practice more often than is articulated or taught or consciously recognized, so that there are, and it's usually picked up by the media or the press, and the media will say, what an extraordinary piece of casting, that casts this person that you wouldn't have thought might look the part, but because they brought the qualities, exactly what you're saying, those qualities is what we go, that who else could play that role? And we know the history of casting is a far more often intuitive rather than a practical one of, do they have blue eyes or brown hair or whatever. And because many good casting directors know, if it's really an issue, you can actually change a lot of those things, particularly these days digitally. But what they are looking for is those qualities that they may not even articulate to the director, but they've read the script and they go, I'm getting these qualities. So I think you're right. It's probably more often an unarticulated and equated with intuition, which I think is only a half truth, that actually they do know what it is they're looking for. It's just they're not very good at articulating it, so that others could benefit from that articulation of naming those qualities.
And that's a really hopeful thing, isn't it? Because the fact that it's already happening means that it can.
I think so.
Happen even more, and then the actors don't need to worry quite so much. I mean, right now, what actors need to be really good at is translating the casting calls that they get and what they know about that casting director and what they know about that director and their style of work, to then go, can I produce the quality that I think they're possibly looking for, as well as looking like the thing that they've described here? Yeah. So you're right. I don't think it's impossible.
Yeah, but I think it's a conversation that's not had very often, and that's why opportunities like this to raise it are really worthwhile. Yeah. So I think as we come to the end of this really rich conversation, I've enjoyed so much talking with you about all these things. So I'd love to give you an opportunity to share with those watching this how this taps into your broader passion, shall I say, around our respect for bodies and the diversity of bodies and those things that you've been speaking about through your TED Talks and through your performance work. Would you like to take a moment to share with us how this connects to that?
Yeah, I mean, yes. All of my work evolves around bodies, and lots of different sort of the body sits in the middle and all of these other things intersect through it. So when I started the research, I joined a local global organization called Endangered Bodies. We exist in 8 different countries, and the UK pocket is called Anybody UK, where I work with Susie Orbach, who wrote Fat as a Feminist Issue and lots of other great books about bodies. And we do lots of work which challenges those aspects of our culture that encourage us to be dissatisfied with our bodies. And particularly we campaign against industries that make a profit from making us feel bad about our bodies. And we do we do big global campaigns, like getting Facebook to remove the I feel fat emoticon off the drop-down bar on the status things, but also lots of local work. So in the UK, we've run lots of Occupy Your Body workshops, and we do lots of work in schools in a project called Shape Your Culture. So yeah, there's lots of sort of activism, and this is all. I mean, the acting work and everything that I'm doing with the actors kind of feeds into that, because we do what we call creative activism, which is that thing about it becoming about the doing of things rather than only thinking about the appearance of things. And yeah, so those things sort of cross over and intersect a lot. And we've got plenty of information on our website. And in fact, there's also an Endangered Bodies Australia.
Is it?
Yes.
Right.
So I think if you go to endangeredbodies.org, then all of the different countries should come up. And yeah, we're all across Europe and in the States and in South America. Yeah, so for anyone who's interested, please do go and have a look. And the different countries have different resource packs and contact addresses, etc.
Right, well, I just put up that website. So is it endangeredbodies.org? Is that right? www.endangeredbodies.org. Great. So people can link into that. And if there's, if you want to type in any other relevant resources, Roanna, you're welcome to do that right now. If you type in.
I don't think I have anything to hand. I'm just seeing. Oh, we also have our blog, which I'm just going to put in here.
Right.
And then,
and as I say, Roanna, you and I can talk later or email, and I can put other links to resources, because I think these worlds feed each other. They really do. That the entertainment world does feed the bigger community, does it not, culturally, with attitudes about the body. So to encourage that conversation amongst all those who might look at the series and have an interest in not only actors' bodies, but how actors' bodies then impact on bodies generally. It's a great place for that conversation to continue.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Well, it's been terrific to talk with you, Roanna, tonight, and to have you share your research and your passions around the importance and the diversity of the body. I might take this moment now to just remind people where they can read Roanna's article as part of our publication about performance, issue 13. And I'm just going to display that now so that if people want to get a fuller picture of actors' lives, you can read Roanna's chapter, which is entitled The Body That Fits the Bill. And that's part of this publication, which is $40 Australian plus postage and handling if you wish to receive a hard copy, or you can just request a PDF copy. So that's available if you click on that link there, or if you go to the website, The Lives of Actors, you can access that there. And then the other thing I like to remind you of, which is coming, in fact, tomorrow or 24 hours from now, our next webinar, which is entitled, Are You in This for the Long Haul? Where I'll be interviewing Anne Pender and Felix Nobis about their research into actors in their middle and late years. And I think it's a great opportunity to hear how actors are keeping up their careers in their later years, and particularly hearing about what they see of the gains that they're able to achieve, but also what are the losses that they may experience in their latter years. So please, if you can, join me for the live webinar, or if not, watch the replay, and please add your questions as always. Happy to respond to them. So that's all for tonight. Thank you, Roanna, for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a delight, and I shall say goodbye to all of you and close tonight's presentation with just a visual reminder of our next webinar. So until next time, stay safe, and goodbye for now.
Bye.
Bye. I'll just